All right, why don't we get started? Um, Hi, everyone. Welcome to the By the Numbers webinar. So glad you could join us. We have a jam-packed agenda. We already have questions coming in, so a question was already raised. We do want your questions. Please feel free to throw them in the chat. We will organize them and try to get them at the end of the presentations. We're going to do a couple quick presentations. We're going to do a little panel Q&A and then open it up to the audience. This is a Zoom webinar. You are automatically muted, so questions will be coming in through the chat and we will be monitoring. So again, thank you for being here today. We're going to delve into two reports that shed light on the current state of U.S. recycling. You'll hear about the Recycling Partnership's recently released State of Recycling report and Ball Corporation's recent 50 states report. I just want to pause here and kind of celebrate that. Just think many of you have been in this business for a long time. And just 10, 12 years ago, we were all scrambling, trying to look for information. What's the landscape look like? Where do we find solutions? And more and more good information's coming out. More stronger and stronger data is coming forward. And here we are, two strong reports for us all to kind of dig into, learn more from, and make reports better next year and the year after that. Both of these reports provide new data, research and analysis, and discuss solutions that could drive real improvement to our recycling system. We see these two reports as complementary and helpful to improving the recycling system. You'll notice some differences in the reports in terms of scope and methodology, but the conclusions are similar and both deepen the understanding of the recycling system and its needs. We could go to the next slide, Marjorie, please. So, welcome. I'm Cody Marshall. I'm the Chief of System Optimization at the Recycling Partnership. To take you through a brief overview of the State Recycling Report is Asami Tanamato, who is the principal author of the report. We also are very fortunate to have Megan Lane with us from the Ball Corporation. Megan will be sharing the findings from the Ball 50 States report. Next slide, please. There it is. And but we're lucky enough to have some other experts that were very much a part of the work at the Recycling Partnership that allows us to write reports like the one you're going to learn about here. So in addition to Asami and Megan, we have Louise Bruce from our Center of Sustainable Behavior and Impact, who can address recycling engagement. Aaron Berman, who leads our data team. He's a bit of a rascal. You got to watch out for him. Dylan Thomas, who can address policy, and Scott Mao, who was also a principal author of this report. All right. So before we jump into this slide, and before I hand it to Asami, I do want to say there's so many moving parts behind a report like this. I'm sure Ball experienced this. I really want to acknowledge Marjorie Apple, who was orchestrated much of this report, helped us write in a way that was tried to distill really easy information that was easy to digest, or difficult information that was easy to digest. And Allison Francis and her design team really trying to put this data in kind of easy infographics to digest. Just really appreciate working with those folks. And before I hand it to Asami, this report begins by looking at the 5 requirements of an effective recycling system through the lens of problem solving, by examining the current needs in packaging recyclability, recycling access, recycling engagement, processing and sortation, and in markets. We pinpoint areas where and how improvements can be made. We can see on this slide the current level of each requirement and the target levels for a thriving recycling system. So this is really how we thought about the report, the foundation of the report, and I will hand it over to Asami to talk through the state of residential recycling.
Thank you, Cody. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Great. Thanks. So parts of what Cody just mentioned, access to recycling, participation of these households with access, and the MRF's ability to process the recyclables were what went into calculating the residential recycling rates. And so first I want to talk a little bit about the access data we have. So our access data comes from our national database, which houses information on the type of recycling collection that's available to residents in each community and what materials are accepted. So we pulled this information from community program websites that are out there. So the squares with more yellow in the figure show places with more opportunities to increase access. For access, we have single family universal curbside, single family subscription, drop off, and multifamily are included. You'll see communities on the West Coast and the East Coast that have long history of having programs that have higher access. We overlaid our estimate of participation on top of this access data here. Based on available data, we made assumptions on participation rates for each access type. So that single family automatic curbside, subscription, drop off, or multifamily, we have an estimate of participation for each of those. And we apply them to the different distribution of access types in each state to get these participation rates. So some parts of the Northeast are more rural, they have higher proportion of drop-off access. We assume lower participation in drop-off programs compared to curbside programs, so that's why some of these high access states still have lower participation. Marjorie, could we, oh, thank you. We combine that access and material acceptance data from our national database with field collected data on household generation, participation, how much recycling participants capture each material type in the recycling bin, and also our knowledge of how much of that material is being captured at the MRF. And all these factors are combined into our model to estimate from the bottom up how much material is generated from homes and how much is recycled. So you can see here that 76% of the materials are not making it to the MRF because some homes don't have access to recycling or can't recycle a material in their city. Maybe they're not participating in the program, or they're not putting all of their recyclables in that recycling container. A smaller amount is lost during sorting at the MRFs, and in total there's over 37 million tons of materials that are not being recycled from residentially generated materials. So you can see in the top part, could you go back a slide, Marjorie? In the top part of the figure, all the material categories that were included in our analysis are listed, and the opportunity to recover more materials exists across all material categories. So for example, 7 out of 10 cardboard boxes, glass, aluminum cans, PET bottles generated from homes are currently not recycled. So next slide. So the different residential makeup, access, and material acceptance in each state result in a range of recycling rates for each commodity. In combining all the materials, we can see how the different states' recycling rates compare in this figure. So the places where we saw the highest access and participation rates before naturally have higher recycling rates. On the other hand, places with lower access in the Gulf region, the Great Plains, they're showing smaller percentage of the residentially generated materials being captured and recycled. Deposit return system or bottle bills, materials collected through those programs are included in our analysis and also contribute to some of these states having higher rates. The recycling rates you'd get from an effective recycling system that Cody mentioned at the beginning of the presentation are in the 60 to 70% range. We already see those rates for glass, aluminum cans, and PET bottles in some of these bottle bill states. So you can already see some impacts of policy on recycling rates today. But this isn't the full picture, so let's look at it another way. When you look at the magnitude of the material lost, the narrative shifts a little bit. So in the previous slide, California looked better than other states, but because it's a large state and there's a lot of materials generated, there's still over 3 million tons of materials that could be recovered. The Great Lakes region also shows a large amount of material that's lost. In contrast, that Great Plains region that looked all red before is green because they're not as populated and don't generate as much materials. Some of the Gulf region states are also small, but Texas shows a large opportunity tonnage-wise, and so does the Southeast. I mentioned the impact of deposit return systems on recycling rates in an earlier slide, but here's where we are headed with some new policy. California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon have passed extended producer responsibility laws, or EPR, to help fund improvements in recycling programs. And we think that successful implementation of EPR in these states could help these states reach those percentages associated with a effective recycling system that Cody shared earlier. These 4 states could increase recycled materials by 2.4 million tons through increased access, engagement, and better sorting at MRFs. Our current estimate of US residential recycling rate that we showed earlier in the presentation is 21%, which really hasn't changed in over a decade. Some of the work we do at the partnership is helping CART communities through grants. We've been able to help bring more than 1 billion pounds of new recycling into the system in the last decade through those CART grants, but that's only 500,000 tons. So passing EPR also doesn't result in immediate change. It takes a few years to get implemented once it's passed, but you can see how critical policy is to scale change. Next slide, please. Some of the next places where policy may catalyze change are Washington, Minnesota, New York State. And as I said, policy is also not an instant leap, right? So we need to keep working in other regions that also have significant opportunities. So for example, there are nearly 5 million multifamily homes along the southeastern seaboard that don't have on-property recycling access, and another 500,000 single-family homes with no recycling access in that region. And those with access already need to participate fully in their recycling program to bring those materials into the system. The Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes regions also have over 10 million tons of materials that are not being recovered right now. There are more than 3 million single-family households and 6 million multifamily households in those 2 regions without access. And added MRF processing for these materials are going to be needed to support increased collection. Major metropolitan areas like Indianapolis, New Orleans, are also places with concentrated population and therefore a larger generation of materials with big opportunities to work on access, material acceptance, engagement, and processing improvements. So, Cody, I don't know if you want to add anything else to this.
No, I think that
This
was
is a
great.
snapshot of what we have in our report.
Yeah, thank you so much, Asami. And we're going to dig back in with some questions. I know what I like about this view is I think we often here at the partnership for sure sit back and say, well, cities can be so different. Each MRF is just so different. And some of that is true, but I think region by region, you can start to look at, we have similar gaps. Similar solutions are needed by a region. How can we make those differences? So I think this can really take the conversation to the next level. Now I'm going to hand it to Megan. She's going to talk to us about the 50 States of Recycling report. I know we have a lot of great questions coming in. Please continue to have them coming in. We're definitely going to talk about methodology, dig into that a little bit. But first, let's hear about that 50 States of Recycling report from Megan. Megan?
Awesome. Thank you, Cody. So
Absolutely.
yeah, my name's Megan Lane. I'm with the Ball Corporation. And so Ball actually published the first 50 States of Recycling back in 2021. And this is intended to be an update to that report. Somewhat differently from the Recycling Partnership report, this is not just looking at residential recycling. This is trying to look at all the materials put onto the market. So whether it's commercial or residential recycling rates as well. So Marjorie, we can go to the next slide. So first I want to have us dive into our actual rankings. So this map here includes all the material generated that could actually be recycled. including fiber and flexible plastics, which is something that we actually exclude from most of the rankings, which we'll talk more about in the methodology. But the reason why I wanted to show this map first before we dive into the packaging recycling rates is because you'll see a big change in what this heat map essentially looks like. So essentially with fiber and flexible plastics, they account for 66% of the waste stream. And looking at this United States map, essentially anything below 20% is going to be kind of an orange-red color. Between 20 to 40 is going to be yellow, and then over 40% is green. So you see most of the recycling rates are well over 20% when we look at fiber and flexible plastics included in this rate. You can go to the next slide, Marjorie. And then when we exclude that, so we're really just looking at packaging, we're able to see how the rest of the system is performing versus having cardboard essentially like insulate that number. And so once again, much lower rates, for example, the state of Colorado is at 11%, even state of Washington, which is, has pretty strong curbside recycling access programs, is at 25% for packaging recycling rates. And we'll go to the next slide. So what we found here is that 9 of the top 10 states for packaging recycling rates have what's called recycling refunds in place, also known as deposit return systems, also known as bottle bills. We can go to the next slide. So the 10 states that have recycling refunds only represent 27% of the US population. However, they account for 47% of all packaging that is recycled. 50% of all the material value, essentially the scrap value that's retained nationally, is coming from these states. 51% of all beverage containers that are recycled nationally, 51% of all glass bottles and aluminum cans recycled nationally, 60% of all PET bottles that are recycled nationally, and 66% of all beverage containers that are recycled in a closed loop nationally, meaning bottle to bottle or can to can, are coming from these states. So it's really states with recycling refunds that are helping bolster the US recycling system. And so in addition to that, we actually in the report wanted to speak to the benefits of moving forward, implementing both extended producer responsibility, which helps really increase residential curbside recycling rates, coupled with a recycling refund system. And so I wanted to use this slide to kind of speak to what some of the benefits and some of the ways that these programs can actually play together before we actually show how that would impact closed loop recycling rates nationally. So deposit return systems or recycling refunds are able to accelerate more quickly because you're actually building out that infrastructure and having that incentive base to where you can achieve high recycling rates within as little as 3 to 5 years. You're also enabling more closed loop recycling or bottle to bottle, can to can recycling because of the material quality and the much higher recovery rates. You also are actually applying it to the full beverage containers that are put onto the market, so whether it's hospitality, businesses, schools, or other institutions, it provides opportunities for recycling those beverage containers as well. And then we also think it's important to note that you can actually co-develop these programs to actually have shared infrastructure. So thinking about areas like rural areas that might not have access to any recycling, there are different provinces and countries that actually have bottle deposit or recycling refund infrastructure to drop off beverage containers that's also being used for single stream recyclables and even hard to recycle items like electronics, appliances, and things of that nature. And then it's really by doing recycling refunds coupled with EPR that you actually see a reduction in litter. So states that have recycling refunds in place have 84% less littered beverage containers than states without one, and see an overall reduction in litter of up to 65%. And then as we're talking about reuse and refill legislation as well, recycling refunds actually provide the mechanism, since you're charging a deposit to the consumer and setting up a drop-off infrastructure where you can actually expand reuse and refill more quickly. And then the last piece is that EPR is really critical because, as I'm sure all of you know, recycling facilities heavily rely on the scrap value from aluminum cans and other beverage containers to bolster the recycling program. So even though, for example, aluminum cans may only make up about 3% of the waste stream, depending upon the MRF and the market, it can make up anywhere between 20 to 50% of a MRF's revenue from scrap. And so by transitioning essentially the policy infrastructure where you're actually having producers pay for the packaging put onto the market and increasing the total throughput of tons for MRFs, that's where these programs can really play hand in hand, where we are both dramatically increasing material quality and the amount that's recycled, especially for closed loop purposes, but also making sure our recycling programs for residents can be expanded throughout the US. So you can go to the next slide, Marjorie. So this shows what the closed loop recycling rate currently is for packaging across the US. So most of the states are well below 20% unless they essentially have a recycling refund program in place. But if we were actually able to pass a national EPR coupled with recycling refunds, you can see how that would dramatically increase closed loop recycling rates for packaging across the board. And then the last slide. So similar to TRP's report, looking at both residential and commercial, United States recycling rates are low. We estimate around a 24% recycling rate. And we try to equate that to what are the current social, economic, and environmental benefits of the system today. So essentially looking at greenhouse gas emission reductions, material value captured, wages generated, and other GVA to the economy, that equates to about $35 billion a year to the US. But if you pass both these policies together, that's what lead to essentially $70.3 billion in environmental, social, and economic benefits. And I think that wraps up my slide deck. So I'll kick it back over to you, Cody.
Wonderful, Megan. Thank you so much. Great stuff to unpack. Again, a lot of questions coming in. So I do want to start by opening it up to our panel, right? So if you could if everyone can kind of come on here basically, and Elise is going to manage that. But so first question, I want to bring Scott Mao in from the Recycling Partnership to help with this, and then Megan, please stick around. Could each of you speak to about where the data is coming from and what is the methodology? And I think we're going to start with Scott, please.
Okay, hey, thank you very much, Cody, for that question, and hello everybody on the webinar today. Really glad to see so many people interested in these questions. We are working very hard in the Recycling Partnership to understand first the size of the recycling pie. How much material are we trying to manage? We gathered some of that data through capture studies that you see represented on this map here. We've done capture studies all over the country, and we continue to do more. I think there's another slide that follows this that shows that we're adding capture rate studies every year. This allows us to look at garbage and recycling side by side and figure out how much recyclable materials entering households, right? So that's super important. And the size of that pie in our report is 47 million tons. Then we look at the fate of materials as it moves through the system. We look at whether or not people have access to a recycling service. We look at whether or not those with that access can recycle certain materials, whether materials are accepted. Both of those pieces of data come from our national database, and we need a lot more communities to be participating with us in the national database. And then when the community has a service and materials are accepted, we also then want to know whether or not people are using the service, i.e. participating, and whether or not they're participating fully, which means are they putting their material, all the materials that are recyclable in their recycling cart. Those are also coming from our capture studies, but we need a lot more data on participation from communities around the country so we can really shore up that metric. And then the final part of the journey is to go to a MRF, and the MRF then takes the materials in the inbound truck and tries to take as many of those commodities as possible and turn them into bales, leaving back to the circular economy. So we use our extensive interaction with MRFs around the country. We've either granted or offered direct technical assistance to about a third of the MRFs around the country to inform the capture rates for specific materials. And if you put all that stuff into a string of math, you get the kind of metrics that we show in the report.
Thank you so much, Scott. And Megan, can you talk to us about the methodology of the 50 States of Recycling report?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, we really tried to look at both residential and commercial recycling. So essentially, we pulled in, depending upon the granularity of the data from each state, whether it's state level data, waste characterizations, MRF facility reports, municipal collection data, and even smaller scale sampling sizes as well. And then we would compare that against consumption trends in that state, and compared to also like what materials are actually put onto the market. And then here, this is kind of what I was referring to earlier. So these are our main material categories. One thing we did add in this time, similar to the Recycling Partnership, is flexible plastics as well, whether it's plastic film, plastic flexible packaging. And then because, combined with cardboard, boxboard, paper packaging, like this category together comprises such a large part of the waste stream, a lot of our analysis really did exclude it, aside from doing a ranking on it, just because they do account for 66% of the waste stream, and it was essentially insulating how the rest of plastics, glass, aluminum, and other materials were performing in the system. You can go to the next slide, Marjorie. And I think the other thing that might be slightly different between our reports is we really tried to emphasize the importance of measuring the real recycling rate, which we defined a bit differently. So it's essentially going after the collection losses that occur, the sortation losses that occur, which varies a lot by material type as well, and after the processing losses that occur, which also varies a lot by material type, where we actually come up with the real recycling rate. And then within the report, we talk about both closed loop recycling and then non-closed loop recycling, but both we kind of counted as real recycling in our report.
Thank you, Megan. And you addressed the film and flex being in the recycling rate a little bit. I think Scott may have touched on it, but Scott, could you talk to us about what our thinking was behind, including it? Just give a little bit more detail behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would invite my colleagues to join in as well. It's a complex topic. It's one that's certainly driving a lot of debate across the recycling industry. A lot of really thoughtful work being done on this issue. What we felt like we needed to do in this report was recognize that thermoflexible packaging is a growing waste stream. It's continuing to replace a lot of traditionally recyclable materials on the shelves in grocery stores, et cetera. And we all can see that walking through the stores in our communities, right? So our job was really to try to account for that material being in the stream and make sure that it's shown, its presence and its status was reflected in this report, while also acknowledging, and we definitely acknowledge this and are working on these issues, that thermoflexible packaging has a long journey ahead of it. It's starting a journey now that PET bottles started 30, 35 years ago. And that means building the kinds of features that we'd want to see for PET bottles that are in place already. Proven commodity values, proven sortability, proven end markets that want the material on a consistent basis, specifications that are driving the marketplace, all those good things. We know a lot of people are working on that. We're working on that as an organization, but we felt it was really important to make sure it was represented in the report. And so we all together as a recycling industry know the math and can think through what that means for the system as a whole.
Thank you, Scott. And I'd like to ask Aaron Berman to come on the screen, but while he's joining us, I do want to say that we're going to answer as many questions as we can, trying to bundle the questions where they're similar from the chat. So I did see maybe a hand or two raised there. We're going to answer questions in the chat. So feel free to use that Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll try to get to them to the best of our ability. So Mr. Berman, could you talk about areas where there's still gaps in data and how you can see it improving going forward? I think Scott just did that pitch, right? That in his conversation about this is just like, we invite you, we keep saying we invite you to check things, give us information so we make sure we're right. You talk to us about those gaps and where we can go and get better.
Yeah, I think that there's quite a few gaps that are still in the data system. I think certainly what we're trying to do is highlight areas where the data has improved over the last few years, and getting a better sense of where people have access to recycling and what that means. We could definitely use much more information about kind of participation information. So how many people in each community are participating in recycling, and some of that kind of variability between communities that have really strong educational programs or ones that don't do it as much. Looking at places that have statewide multifamily recycling ordinances, and understanding sort of the on-property access for multifamily, and how many, how effective are some of these policies. So we certainly want to see, increases in participation information, and kind of on-property multifamily, and then how many people within multifamily households, multifamily housing, how much do they participate in the recycling system as well. And this stuff is all very critical, obviously, for projecting out the effects of EPR, but then also the effects of other statewide ordinances and things like that. Also really looking for more capture rate study information. We use kind of a standard generation rate for households, for single family and multifamily households around the country. But we do know that there's variability in that. But with all the studies that we've done, we didn't want to try to project sort of different generation rates for different states. We find that overall the data seems to show that they're fairly standard, but we would want to definitely see more data there where we could dig into and understand kind of regional differences in the generation and recovery of materials.
Aaron, would you mind just add something to that super quick? That's a great point from Aaron. And so as you see in the report, what we're trying to put forward for us all to work on in the recycling industry is a capture mindset, so that we know where the materials are they in the garbage or in the recycling? We measure that side by side. We know a lot of communities do waste composition studies on a regular basis. We'd love to see those morph into capture studies, so we get more of that side-by-side performance data that comes from a capture mindset. We also know a lot of states are going to be using EPA funding in the next few years for waste composition studies. Super important data, but it's only one part of the view, right? It's only what's disposed. We need to see what's recycled side by side if we can. And if we all work on that together in the recycling industry and build that data set up, we'll really know more about the full performance of the system. So just want to make sure a pitch for a capture mindset. That's what we show in the report, and for us all to work together to improve that data.
Hit us with the capture rate study again, Scott, like just a quick kind of definition of a capture rate study, because you hit it, like everybody's used to waste audits. Just give us the quick kind of one-liner on what it is.
One-liner. I don't know if I could do that. I don't even know a good joke about it.
14 words. Do it in 14 words.
Okay, you measure garbage and recycling side by side simultaneously, and you're able to see where the materials are in real time on both sides. And if you do that math together, then you can create a generation estimate and a capture estimate. Is the material on the right side or the wrong side of the equation?
Wonderful. Thank you. We got a lot of questions coming in about this methodology, how we get rates and participation stuff. So hopefully we can get into that. But I'd love to invite Megan back in here with Aaron. Megan, we'll start with you, and Aaron can come in after. But when you look at the report side by side, many of the state recycling rates are different, but the conclusions are broadly the same. Can you speak about some of the differences and similarities, starting with Megan?
Sure. I mean, happy to. So I think some of the differences, there is a bit of a difference in our methodologies, right? Both in terms of what's captured, in terms of we are trying to look at all the material that's generated for a state that's potentially recyclable, whether it's from the commercial or the residential sector. And for example, when it comes to cardboard recycling in the commercial sector, it's much more robust than some of the other material types. So that's one of the reasons that we just chose to exclude cardboard, for example, from our main ranking. But I would say overall, many of the states are very similar. I think, and generally, both reports also are calling for the need for improvements, especially as regards to policy.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think just to kind of build on what Megan said there, our report is just looking at residential. The ball one does include kind of those commercial streams as well. So some of the backhauling of things or the commercial recycling of cardboard don't make it into our data. We do also, we kind of broaden the accepted materials in two ways. We look at printed paper as well. I think the ball report is focused just on packaging, so sort of what you buy things in, but we also would include newspapers and magazines and things like that as well. And then also, since we do kind of come from that community recycling background, we also look at bulky rigid plastics as another one, since that's something that is accepted. And so there's a couple places where we differ in kind of what the accepted materials or what the range of materials are that we're considering. And then I guess the only thing is I've kind of mentioned that we're using sort of this average generation rate, whereas their methodology took data from state reports as to how much was getting recycled. And so each of them kind of have their, each of them are taking samples of data or samples of waste and recycling, and using that to kind of project what's happening throughout the state. Unfortunately, we don't have RFID tags on every possible thing ever that we could track exactly where it's going. That probably isn't a good idea, just to put it out there. But, we don't always know. So we're always trying to estimate, what's happening to these things after they leave someone's house.
And we've, so as we're talking about it, I think we've established both reports incorporate deposit numbers. Anything, Aaron and Megan, to elaborate on there? I just want to move through some questions that keep coming up, but both reports, deposit numbers are reflected in those. Talk to us about recycling, how recycling rates are measured. If you could hit on that briefly again. We kind of talked through it when we did the presentations, but how were recycling rates measured? Megan, start with you.
Sure, absolutely. So we, essentially we're an aluminum can company. So we rely on what aluminum is actually turned back into can sheet. And so we really measured the real recycling rate, or what we term that as in our report, after everything that goes through processing losses, right? Like even like PET needs to be processed before it can be turned back into a PET bottle, like such as being, washed, flaked, etc. And so we really measure it there, whereas I believe the Recycling Partnerships report measures it after it goes through a MRF. But Aaron, I'll trust you to correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so ours does looks at basically just the residential stream, how much is collected for recycling, and then we do estimate the losses at the MRF. But then we're just looking at sort of what is the amount that's being sold from the MRF or the processor to the end market, and not necessarily looking at kind of what is the loss at the secondary processor or things like that. So yeah, we are really looking at, again, sort of our data is really honed a lot in on those capture rate studies and participation rates. And that's sort of how we're able to build from, kind of the access data all the way up to that recycling rate, looking at a generation and then an estimated recovery.
And I think we have there's a lot of energy around questions coming in. I want to kind of maybe pause and I'll just pick on Scott again. For the recycling partnership, where did you get the numbers? Like that people were just like, I wasn't asked about my program's tonnage. Can we maybe try to address it another way, Scott, if you can try to hit it from another angle?
Yeah, well, I'm so excited that people are really engaged on this metrics question, because that's one of the things that we really wanted to accomplish with this report, is to really drive more discussion, drive more data. We all know, being in this industry for a long time, that there's a continual lack of data. So super excited how people are reacting to that, right? So again, we have developed data systems that my colleague Aaron has worked very hard on to try to track the 9,000 programs around the country and the kinds of services that are offered. And what is accepted in this program. So we have a massive database to try to measure that. And that's the sort of the base of the pyramid, you might say, of this data exercise that sits on top of that 47 million tons that we're trying to manage, right? So then we need to know how well people are using those services that we're measuring. So we, again, use capture studies. We use this data that comes from community recycling programs. We're always open to getting more and more data on tonnage and performance rates and participation rates to drive this data. And that's the next part of the equation, if you will. Then we're having to use some factors and assumptions around participation, that are informed by data that's come to us, but in many cases are just a good professional estimate through our interaction with communities. We think we know what people do with their materials when they have a recycling cart. We get that again from capture studies. We know that people put 4 out of 5 pounds of cardboard in their cart, and only 3 out of 5 aluminum cans in their cart, right? That comes from that data. And then we need to know more about, but we have good estimations of how good MRFs are at taking inbound commodities and making a bale out of it. And there's certainly loss there, and we comment on that in the report. And again, that's just kind of a wonky math equation. You walk through that 47 million tons and the loss points where those things are occurring, then you get what we're showing in the report. The report is really designed to drive dialogue. So that's so exciting. Again, people are reacting to this. And if it turns on a river of data coming our way, we're going to be super happy about that. We need participation data. We need MRF capture data. We need your tons of programs. Aaron, I don't know if you want to talk about the RPS, but maybe that's a good thing to chat about as well.
Yeah, there was there's, I guess, two ways that communities can make sure that their data is incorporated into the database that we have and can be used in sort of future reports and information. And one of them is through the Municipal Measurement Program, which is a partnership that we have with Emerge Knowledge, the maker of Retrack. And so there's a few hundred communities in the U.S. that report their their information and data through that system, and we do a check to verify it and then incorporate it into the database. And then we've also launched what we call the Recycling Program Solutions Hub, and that's a place where communities can log in and verify that the information that we've collected from the publicly available websites is accurate and up to date. And that's looking at sort of how the how people in the community get access to the program, what materials are accepted, and things like that as well. So we can we're certainly interested in more communities verifying the information. This is such a critical piece of the trust that we want, that I think is so important for the system, for people to gain trust again in. So we don't want different information coming from different sources, and are working really hard to make sure that that it's aligned.
And Megan, I think I heard you say that the data in your report is coming from state recycling reports. I don't know if you need to elaborate any more on that.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely states without recycling reports as well. So I think it's one of those things of there's different levels of assumptions that need to be made. Our consulting firm, Eunomia, did reach out to state government employees and even some local government employees, depending upon like the level of data that was available.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to pivot from the methodology here real quick. There's a ton to dive into, but I do want to jump into some other pieces. I want to, we can come back to methodology if we have time. But Dylan, I'd love to ask you a question. Both reports call for policy, specifically EPR, to drive system improvements. This is extended producer responsibility. How does EPR improve the system?
Thank you for asking, and I appreciate it. I've been answering questions furiously in the Q&A, so I have to get in public space mode. We actually issued a report last year that highlighted how impactful extended producer responsibility can be if implemented well, if well designed and well implemented. We also published a guidance memo of how well EPR works with bottle bills or DRS. So I'll do a shout out and I'll put links to both of those reports in the Q&A section in a moment. But what we found is that it really delivers results is the main thing. We've talked about lack of access. We've talked about inconsistency of access, especially in the multifamily sector. And one of the exciting things that we're seeing as the 4 states that have passed EPR are working through implementation is how everyone is going to get access to recycling, or most residents in states will be able to have that equal level of access everywhere, and either all of or the difference in the improvements to the recycling will be paid for by the producers who put the packaging on the marketplace, which is very exciting, and also something that we see is really incredibly effective at increasing volumes, as well as delivering a more consistent, robust recycling system for residents everywhere.
Thanks, Dylan. And Megan, Dylan, you mentioned that EPR and combined with DRS. Megan mentioned a little bit too earlier, but could you elaborate on that a little bit, Megan? Why is the combination important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am going to walk us through just very quickly some of the high-level findings, because we did actually model the outcomes of EPR essentially on its own versus the 2 policies combined together for the state of Washington. So you can go to the next slide. And press play. Hopefully, Marjorie, hopefully that works. So currently, recycling rates for packaging in Washington are at 26%. Through EPR, we expect that to cap out around 59%, but with the systems being done together, that could actually go up to 78% for packaging and over 90% for beverage containers. So if we go to the next slide, hopefully you'll be able to progress to the next one. Yeah, there we go. So the other piece here that's really important is for the ability for these policies to accelerate. And obviously recycling refunds, very similar to EPR, is a form of EPR for beverage containers, and is really the only proven policy mechanism out there to achieve over 90% recycling rates, which for some of us manufacturers is really important as we're trying to help our customers deliver on their net zero goals and higher recycled content goals. So in the state of Washington, the baseline recycling rate today is 30%. Through the implementation of EPR on its own, we modeled that beverage container recycling rates would increase to 62% by year 9 after legislation is implemented. Versus if you did both policies together, you could actually see recycling rates for beverage containers achieve 90% by year 5 and 94% by year 7. So if we're talking about near-term goals as it relates to climate, enabling really high recycling rates quickly will be important. And going to the next slide. So how this essentially is mapped out over cumulative tons over 15 years. So under EPR for beverage containers, we see a 63% increase over the baseline, but both programs together is what enables a 172% increase over baseline of 3.6 million tons recycled over that time frame. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the other really important piece is how both policies together really enable more closed loop recycling. So through just implementing EPR, we see that we think the closed loop recycling rate will likely increase from 20% to 41%. But it's really with both policies being done together that we can see that jump up to 78%, whether it's plastic, aluminum, or glass. That's an average. And then that's what enables curtailing packaging related emissions by up to 70% for the state. So thanks, Cody.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is so much information. I think we could just have an hour on that in that conversation, Megan. So thank you. There was a question that came in to the recycling partnership. Do we intend to engage corporations in the importance of EPR? And yes, in the report, we actually call where there's action items that for local governments that run programs and corporations. We want to see design for recyclability and supporting EPR. For sure, this is a tool we want to use to start that conversation and push smart policy forward. Dylan, anything to add there?
Yeah, it's our very model. You've maybe heard our CEO talk about assist and insist with these companies that are putting packaging on the marketplaces to help them as well as to push them to be able to deliver more recyclable packaging and to support recycling where policies maybe are unlikely to pass. Somebody mentions, EPR and DRS are not necessarily going to pass in every single state. And so we have to support recycling in those states as well, and perhaps collaborate and find policy solutions for them. In the interim, though, you could think of the recycling partnership as a voluntary producer responsibility organization that we're able to put the capital on the ground in those communities to be able to help increase those volumes, partnering with cities in that public-private partnership as we do, absent policy where we do engage with companies to help drive for those policies as well. Thank you, Cody.
Thanks, Dylan. I'd like to, there's some, in the questions, there were questions about like, well, how do you improve? What's the best way to message? So I'm going to want to pivot quickly. I'm so nervous about this time. We got about 10 minutes left. Louise, I'd love to bring you forward to ask you a couple questions. Our State of Recycling report tells us that only 43% of households participate in recycling. Some of that is because of the lack of access, but even among residents that have access, 59% use their recycling service. How do we improve participation, Louise?
So I'm going to offer some starter ideas here because this is a big topic, as you say, Cody. But
participation in 10 minutes is what we're all asking.
Well, I think the short answer actually is if we take a human-centered, evidence-based approach, we really can solve for this participation issue. We now a year and a half ago launched what we call our Center for Sustainable Behavior and Impact, which is we have this focused mission of making measurable improvement in recycling behaviors. And we do that by running surveys, but then understanding at a national level what is motivating people to recycle, what barriers are they experiencing, what are the key trends that we're seeing, and we use that information to prototype solutions and then put those in the field, because the difference here is that we're looking not just at what people say they want, but actually what changes their behavior at the bin. And so when I said starter ideas, I thought I'd offer a couple of really huge opportunities that we're seeing. So one, I think we need messaging that actually captures people's attention and meets them where they are. Why do I say that? Well, we're seeing that 75% of Americans, 75%, can't recall ever receiving a communication about their local recycling program. And often that's because they're not. Too many programs are under-resourced to provide the outreach and education at sort of the volumes and levels that we know is necessary. But often that's because they're not seeing the communications that we're sending them. Perhaps it's because we're not sending them at the right time, sort of integrating into their lives at the places when people most need that information or are most open to receiving it. Or perhaps it's because we're not kind of sending the messaging that they will notice. So I'll give you an example. We've seen some very compelling evidence that empathetic messaging that addresses confusion and frustration head on has statistically significant increases in, first, the capture of attention. So we see these great metrics of people clicking on messages and so forth that address confusion and frustration head on. But also actually in some of our pilots, we've seen that increase the materials that are captured at the bin, like in Reynoldsburg, Ohio, where we saw that increase capture by 38%, or route tonnage by 38%. So the point there being that by delivering, the right type of messaging that captures people's attention, that feels like we're showing them we care about them, we understand the feelings they're experiencing, we're seeing much sort of bigger uptake or many more people listening to us than they would if we sent sort of more traditional why messaging or logical messaging.
I muted myself. Yeah, so we do hear a lot about like, oh, that just sounds like we're putting it on the consumer. It's their fault. It's the resident's fault. Just can you kind of like, you could almost answer that question again, although we don't have a lot of time, Louise, but like ensuring that like how would you answer that? Like, Louise, you're just saying it's everyone's fault. Like, we have to change their behavior. I'm like so happy to receive that question, because the answer is just a simple no. It's not people's fault. It is, and we need to be really clear about that. We really need to be really clear that it is incumbent on all of us as, the stakeholders across the recycling value chain when we're designing a package. We need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is rooted in the evidence we see around what people understand about labels and packaging design. When we're designing a program that tries to fit into people's lives, we need to be thinking about what are the tools from in-home bins to the curb, the cart at the curb that they need that's going to make that as easy as possible, because we are asking people for time, we are asking people for space in their homes. And it's a big ask. I spend a lot of time with my colleagues at the center in people's homes, really looking at the challenges they face on a day-to-day basis. And I just really want to emphasize that it is a big ask we're making of the 125 million US households that we need to actively participate. However, I do want to say that they want to participate. They're telling us that they value the recycling program. We're seeing indication that whether their community has recycling actually is a point of pride for a lot of people. And we're seeing that members of communities where recycling isn't available, they're actually saying it would make me prouder to live here if I had a recycling program. We're seeing that people expect that they should have to participate and that their neighbors should have to participate, and they're demanding better service and better tools and resources from all of us. So I think people see their role, and it's on us to really help make that as easy as possible, as clear as possible, and frankly, as rewarding and delightful as possible. And I think we can do that with, as I say, this sort of evidence-backed, data-rooted approach to how do we best deploy the tools in our toolbox to support people. Yeah. Thank you, Louise. Again, we want to dig in there. For those, I'm just going to quick pivot for those that want to dig into this. We want you to join us. We'll be in Palo Alto, February 21st and 22nd, digging into this topic. We have a ton of resources on our website with Louise trying to unpack, how we find some solutions to get more recyclables in the right container. Louise, if you would mind, can you put in the chat where they can find the knowledge report and then some of that, if you haven't already? You may have already, and I apologize if you have.
I have not. I will do that.
So we want to round out this conversation. I have one final question. I think that I'll bring in Scott Nasami and Megan for the final question. And I just want to remind people that we will be sharing the slides and the recording. If you want to listen to me host a webinar again, you could just kind of share this with the family. We are also going to try to bundle the questions and answer them. There were a bunch that came in. We tried to answer some common themes, but we're gonna try to bundle those up in the response to you all, and try to answer some key questions we see in there to bring clarity as we can. But to kind of end the conversation, we just have a couple minutes left. Megan, I'll start with you. What surprised you about this report?
That's such a good question.
You and your team, not you specifically, but you can also just talk about
Sure.
your team.
Yeah, such a great question. And I think there were so many things, but I think the two pieces, and they're tied together, is one, I think the dramatic implementation timeline difference and the impact on recycling and doing both those policies together was shocking for us. It was one of those things we kind of had a hypothesis about, but seeing it modeled, I think, was really impactful for our team. And then the impact on closed loop recycling, frankly, in terms of coming from a curbside system versus kind of EPR and recycling refunds together, was really impactful for us, since we care most about can-to-can recycling, obviously.
Wonderful. Asami, I'll throw it to you, and then Scott, what surprised you about this report?
Yeah. I think, having worked at the partnership for a while, there were a lot of things that we kind of knew was happening, but to actually see it in terms of tons, the gap with engagement that's happening, for example, in California, there's high access, but engagement is needed to bring more of those tons back in. So to have those numbers, I think it really sheds light on what is needed to improve the system.
Wonderful. And Scott, what surprised you? You've been at this for a while.
Maybe the revelatory part of it for me is, sort of seeing that string of factors that really make for success in recycling. Again, access, material acceptance, participation, participant capture, MRF capture. That is really now a playbook. And that's really one of the things that we wanted to put in this report, is to allow communities and states to act on that playbook. Every single one of those elements are solvable. And if we all work together on them, I think we can really see some huge impacts.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks to the full panel. Megan, very cool that you joined us to talk about your report. People were just, singing the praises about that good work. There's a lot of other great folks on this call too that have good resources. So please, everyone, the call to action is to stay engaged, question this, and let's make all of our data better the next time around, and try to make these improvements in recycling. I want to thank everyone for coming to participate, and thank our panel. We will be sending the recording. We will be sending the slides, and trying to answer some of these questions as a follow-up with all of the participants. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you guys so much.